In this video, I'm going to be taking a look back at all the Starcraft releases. Starcraft 1, Brood War, Wings of Liberty, Heart of the Swarm, and Legacy of the Void. I'm going to be looking at them from the perspective of someone who kinda sucks at multiplayer Starcraft. However, the games have never actually stopped people like me from having fun and enjoying it. So, let's take a look. Starcraft has pretty much been one of the world's most visible and popular real-time strategy titles for more than a decade and a half. Top competitors devote considerable portions of their daily lives to mastering it, and in South Korea, matches are such a shared enthusiasm that they're broadcast on television. Starcraft is such serious business, and has such a reputation for demanding physical and mental dexterity on the part of the player, that people lose sight of one of the things that makes Starcraft so genuinely remarkable. It's just as enjoyable if you're awful at the game, as it is for people who compete at the top level. The game is complicated, and mastery requires a deep understanding of the game's mechanics and rhythms that I don't and likely will never have. Yet, the experience I can have with StarCraft is still incredibly rewarding. The triumph's genuine, and the time feels well spent. That's the genius of StarCraft. It's well balanced to the point of relaying a consistent play experience across a gigantic diversity of skill levels and time investments from the player. I'm by no means a StarCraft expert. I'm a rank amateur at it, but I've been an amateur at the game for 17 years, and I've loved every minute of it. A lot of that is on the strength of the original game's single-player campaign, and its role as a 20-hour tutorial in the form of a warmly written and tightly wound space opera. The vibrant multiplayer experience, one that's structurally very similar all the way from the 1998 original to the last expansion in 2015, is where the true challenge of the game has always been. But the single-player experience is the key to understanding the game's widespread, mainstream appeal to players who aren't serious RTS genre fans. You don't just throw yourself against the speed and skill of other players right away. You let the game teach itself to you over the course of more than 30 levels, each dedicated to communicating a new tactic or unit and pitting you against an ever-increasing level of threat. Unlike a human opponent, though, the AI in the missions is meant to be defeated if you're learning what the game is teaching. Success is defined by increasing your tactical repertoire, and then framed by a very fast-moving and warmly delivered narrative. There's a great momentum to StarCraft's single-player experience, one that was a huge step forward in 1998, and remains as enjoyable in 2016. What was especially unique for the time was the idea of asymmetrical unit balance. Each side played differently, had different rhythms of production, different methods of attack and defense, but none has a natural advantage. Blizzard's previous two RTS titles, Warcraft 1 and 2, had no real differences between the orcs and humans besides spellcasters, and each side's single-player campaign was a mirror of the other one. StarCraft was different. Each side's campaign builds on the previous one's plot, makes the whole game a linear, non-contradictory story. It's a lot more memorable than the parallel structures of early Blizzard and Westwood titles. Not only is the single-player experience an extensive tutorial, it's a crash course in the themes behind the races, the mechanics along with the intent, in a single, tightly constructed package. StarCraft starts you out with the Terrans, an army of space yokels. Your first mission has you assisting the local marshal of a frontier world, Marsara, under the Confederacy of Planets. Some kind of alien race, the Zerg, are striking at fringe settlements. The Terrans are consistently presented as hard-drinking, guitar-picking, Zerg-wrestling frontier folks, with the eventual exception of your more advanced troops who act a little more professionally. So what you've got is a classic horror setup, monsters coming in from the wilderness with the bumpkin townfolk unprepared. But framed in this deliberately, weirdly comedic sci-fi way, with truckling marines wielding giant automatic rifles and decked out in power armor, gleefully firing away at a monstrous enemy and then crying out before getting reduced to a bright red smear on the battlefield, the clichés seem really fresh. StarCraft 1 is always hesitant to take itself seriously, although later releases would slide that direction. More than any details of the plot, what the first game does is establish the tone, the look, and the rhythms that would define the entire franchise across 17 years of production. Comedy and camp are deliberately woven into all aspects of the game, from unit dialogue to the colorful slaughter of conflict, and the game is mightily empowered by it. Of course, comedy isn't why you start with the Terrans. You start with them because they're the most conventional of the game's three races in terms of how they play. Terrans are straightforward, and their economies of crystal Vespene harvesting and multiple structure production are identical to the orcs and humans of Warcraft. Blizzard fans, or Westward fans for that matter, wouldn't get any curveballs in the basic game design right away. StarCraft was saving those for later on. The Terran campaign goes by quickly and teaches you the raw basics for most of it, but By the third mission, Desperate Alliance, you're building a sprawling base and defending it from consistent attack, waiting half an hour for the dropships to arrive and save Marshal Rayner's colonists from an overwhelming Zerg assault. The mission is so classic that variations show up both in Warcraft 3's 5th level in the human campaign, March of the Scourge, and also in 0 Hour in Starcraft 2's Terran campaign, where the game places it as Mission 2 and also has it take place on Marsara. What makes Desperate Alliance so iconic is how it rearranges the Zerg and Terrans' obvious influence, the aliens and colonial marines of Fox's Alien franchise, translating it into a tactical perspective with a unique art style. That hadn't really been done before. First-person alien stuff, sure, but pitting armies of wisecracking space marines against the spiny, mucusy multitude, that was a new kind of game experience in 1998. And even though it pulls on some deep-rooted pop culture references, StarCraft's rhythms of play are so satisfying and immediate that it stands apart as its own concept. Desperate Alliance specifically helped define what StarCraft is thematically and feels like mechanically. The mission shows that the game is more than a knockoff translation of a more recognizable franchise. There's more going on with the Zerg than just avoiding copyright infringement, yet still putting xenomorphs and space marines in the same game. And there's more going on with the Terrans than just bullets and brewskis. Something I think it's key to emphasize about the first StarCraft is how flawless its presentation is for the time, how well the art of the cinematics, the art of the mission briefings, and the art of the primary game itself complement each other, how they all contribute to an instantly recognizable StarCraft look. The Command & Conquer series used live-action cutscenes to deliver briefings between the missions, and while they're fun, they age poorly. Warcraft 2's presentation was much simpler and less ambitious than StarCraft as well. Mission briefings were just a scrolling summary of goings-on narrated in hammy accents. The cinematics of Warcraft 2 were kinda neat, but pretty simple, and frequently unmoored from any direct plot events. StarCraft uses its cinematics to set up and advance the plot, and there is a hell of a lot of plot, told with more immediacy than Warcraft 2 ever mustered with its scrolling dialogue mission briefings. Each mission teaches the player a game mechanic or presents a strategic puzzle. Terran missions teach you how to use dropships to perform assaults across gaps in the terrain, or how to balance air and ground defense, or how to use ghosts to target your nuclear weapons, or show you when and where to fire and when to reserve the Yamato cannon on the tremendously expensive battlecruiser. Each mission also helps draw you into the world and the characters of StarCraft. Narratively, the Terran campaign is a straightforward story about betrayal. The Confederacy wouldn't help Jim Raynor, so he turned to the fringe group, the Sons of Korhal, to extract his people from Marsara and the Desperate Alliance mission. Arcturus Mengsk, leader of the Sons of Korhal, is obviously a villain, but it takes Raynor a while to figure that out. Meanwhile, he and Sarah Kerrigan, Mengsk's right hand, bond and flirt as the Sons accomplish their war and begin collapsing the Confederacy. This was so much different and more epic than what was going on in a lot of other RTS titles, more imitative of movies certainly, but with a clear understanding of how to adapt cinematic flourishes to the pacing and artistic limitations of a real-time strategy game in 1998. Command & Conquer threw in literal movie clips to feel cinematic. Total Annihilation pretty much skipped out on plot entirely. StarCraft just borrows the cinematic elements it knows that it can functionally use. By the end of the Terran campaign, Kerrigan is lost to the Zerg, Raynor is on the run, and Mengsk is the supreme ruler of this sector of the galaxy. A downer to end on, if it ended there, but ending on this note for the Terran campaign just sets up a primary theme of the next one, calculated revenge. Where in the Terran campaign your player character was a colonial magistrate, you play a giant sack of grey matter called a cerebret in the Zerg campaign. The Overmind, the true will of the Zerg, has manifested you into creation to serve his will and protect his greatest legacy, a chrysalis that won't hatch until Mission 4. The Zerg campaign also ramps up its difficulty by a good few notches over the Terran campaign. The first 3 missions are easy enough, teaching you the new production rhythm of the Zerg. Instead of having barracks and factories, each primary structure, the hatchery, has up to 3 larvae, which the hatchery will continuously replenish. All the other structures are there to facilitate upgrades and section off the advanced units. Terrans have large bases that produce multiple units and multiple structures. Zerg bases are smaller and necessitate multiple hatcheries or multiple satellite bases with hatcheries for production. But once you have that established, you can produce entire 12-unit squads at once. The balance is well considered. Neither Terrans nor Zerg have an innate advantage over one another. It's the confidence and skill of the player with their chosen side, and the rhythms of that side's production that determines the advantage. But playing as the Zerg is a totally different game experience from playing the Terrans. Even the art of the interface changes to reflect the new alignment and disposition, swapping out a steely industrial look for the fleshy, chaotic one. By the time you hit Mission 4, Agent of the Swarm, the kid gloves are off. Agent of the Swarm has you defending the Chrysalis from a heavy Terran assault, led by Jim Raynor, as the Chrysalis opens at last. Inside is Kerrigan, twisted into a new and unique Zerg, meant to lead the armies that will finally allow the Overmind to physically manifest itself on the distant world of Ire. But defeating Raynor, with Kerrigan leading the charge, is the hardest mission of the game by that point, by a fair margin. Starcraft 1 and its Brood War expansion don't have an adjustable difficulty. You either learn the tactics you need to win, or you lose. In Agent of the Swarm, you need to understand how to aggressively expand into satellite bases across canyons of fire that you can't just walk over, with an entrenched enemy on the other side. It's tricky, but doable, and if you can do that, you're really getting the hang of the game. Then on to Ire, and the destiny of the Overmind. Ire, which is also the homeworld of the, at this point, mysterious third race in the game, the Protoss. You fought the Protoss once as the Terrans, but in the Zerg campaign, they really start to become critical to the plot. Kerrigan is entirely wonderfully monstrous, bloodthirsty, and impulsive, but the Protoss are pretty much the opposite of that, and the High Templar Tassadar outwits her, even though you, as Kerrigan's agent, smash their war machine pretty solidly. Ire falls. The Overmind reigns supreme. It's another campaign where a villain wins by the end of it, but instead of having a betrayer defeating you, you've elevated your ancient master to the heights that it dreamed of for millennia. By this point, the Protoss are in a precarious situation, a situation that only the player can resolve. The Protoss are a kind of high-technology fantasy race. They've got elegant golden armies, slightly more expensive to produce than comparable Terran and Zerg units, that are protected by regenerating shields. If the shields fail, their units are generally on the fragile side. Instead of sacrificing a drone to build a structure like the Zerg, or having an SCV stay busy constructing a single structure, like the Terrans do, the Protoss warp their structures in from elsewhere. Only a single probe is needed to do any and all construction, freeing up all the others for resource gathering. The Protoss are more dependent on abilities and micromanagement than the other two races. It makes a lot of sense to save their campaign for last, because they require a lot of familiarity with the basic rhythms of play to get the hang of. They're also a great addition on top of Marines vs. Aliens. They seem like the most powerful of the three, and on a 1 versus 1 unit-by-unit basis they often are, but they're still held in a strong balance with the Terran and Zerg by their economy. The Protoss campaign is defined by long, protracted missions against multiple foes set up in well-defended and genuinely massive bases. The tactical situations are increasingly complicated, and the plot has you fighting against other Protoss for a big chunk of the missions. Most of the plot involves Tassadar, a High Templar, and Zeratul, a Dark Templar from an exiled tribe of the Protoss, who devise a plan to destroy the Overmind and save Ire. But the Protoss are very stuffy about tradition, so although the Overmind and the near destruction of their homeworld is a major problem, working with Zeratul is more offensive to the Conclave. The Protoss are a high-camp kind of sci-fi race, speaking in too earnest declaratives about everything, and getting real twisted up about how tradition can't abide by a changing galaxy. I wonder if the writing took this direction mostly so as to present you with so many Protoss versus Protoss levels. They're probably the most difficult sorts of fights to come out on top of, especially if you're more at home with a nice little death ball of balanced units than with the micromanagement of abilities. But if you don't learn, you can't advance. Eventually, you battle the Zerg Overmind for control of Ire, tasked with building out both a Terran and a Protoss base, and then converging on the Overmind in a joint attack. It's a satisfying climax in a lot of ways. Brings the units you began the game with back around for a special, extra-difficult assault on the big, villainous brain god, and it gives you the destructive opportunity to blast deep into a map that's wall-to-wall Zerg. It's Starship Troopers, but with the player in meaningful tactical control. When the Overmind is beaten, the extremely one-dimensionally noble Tassadar sacrifices himself to make sure that the Overmind stays dead. It doesn't, but it's a tidy end and a good skill level to jump into multiplayer with. However fun it is to play the good-natured space opera of Starcraft, the fantastic campaign was just a lead-in to the game's internationally successful main attraction, playing against the unpredictable skills of other people through Battle.net, Blizzard's proprietary, easy-to-use matchmaking service. The world of competitive Starcraft was too difficult for me as a kid, and as an adult, the people still playing Starcraft 1 whooped my ass at 27 as hard as they did when I was 12, so multiplayer Starcraft passed me by for the most part, and still seems like a whole different way of experiencing the game that I'm really interested in ever getting serious about. I like playing Starcraft casually, but the basis of skill at higher levels of play is not only dependent on encyclopedic knowledge of the units and build orders, but on actions per minute, however many clicks and orders you're able to issue compared to your opponent. I would be shocked if I issued more than 20 or so in a minute. A good minute. Serious players average 100 or more, professional players sometimes much more. Brood War, the expansion to Starcraft, is built to challenge the players who know Starcraft inside and out. Warcraft 2's expansion, Beyond the Dark Portal, had a similarly expert and up design philosophy, and while it was fun, I never truly learned the game well enough to beat it. Same with Brood War. Its campaign is equally long as Starcraft 1's, longer, actually, because of the tremendous length of the majority of missions. It's got a ton of interesting world building, and a slightly sharper standard of dialogue writing than the main campaign. But there's only one standard difficulty setting, and it's beyond my ability. More specifically, beyond the time I want to invest in the game. Starcraft can't ever be mastered on a casual basis. There's such a heavy element of dexterity with the mouse and keyboard along with memorization of tactical rhythms that if there are long gaps in your playing of it, your skill will drain out, half-remembered, like the language you took in high school. So Brood War is worthwhile for the challenge and the world building, but if you're not any good at the game, it's a weird time investment. In other games, a loss is quick and obvious. In StarCraft, because of the push and pull of conflict and income, it can be a long time before you realize that you've lost. If you're a truly bad player, you'll lose pretty quickly. But if you're a mediocre player, there's a tendency in the single-player difficulty, and when matched against other amateur players, for them to just drag on and on and on, prolonging the inevitable, never finding a real advantage, but dodging total destruction long enough to while away a good chunk of an hour. I just don't find it that satisfying. It's not like you can't see yourself improving over time, and I'm sure there's a threshold at some point where a person might start finding victories, but for me at least, the reward for improvement at StarCraft 1 was making you wait longer to lose. However, that's because I've never really truly appreciated the thing that made Brood War such a major improvement over the original. Increased micromanagement without sacrificing any balance. What's really crazy about Brood War, and why Brood War matches are still being broadcast and ranked, is that it takes the already excellent balance of units, drops in almost a dozen new ones, and not only doesn't upset the balance, but refines it. Each race has a whole new set of tactical options, and all the new units are meant to be very strong contenders in very specific situations, like the Lurkers for the Zerg, a Hydralisk variant that has to be buried in the ground to attack, and the attacks are in a long straight line, or the Protoss's Dark Archon, which can mind control other powerful units. The favored strategy of the mediocre StarCraft player is the Death Ball, a big army that you move as a whole and attack an area with. The assault is large enough that micromanagement is pretty much besides the point. To use these new units effectively in combat, you need to have gotten hotkeys down. I hate using hotkeys. Proper use of hotkeys is the single most important thing for a high actions per minute performance. Every unit has a particular moment and circumstance where it shines, so Brood War matches are less the Death Ball versus Death Ball affairs of the first game, although there's still plenty of that at the amateur level, and more of a tic-tac-toe of trying to engineer situations where your selection of units can best utilize their unique advantages. It's a whole different rhythm. It's why the matches have been consistently engaging for such a wide audience to follow at the professional level. There are so many different options and variations for attack and defense. The only significant problem is with the matchmaking. Outside of ladder-style tournament play, the random pairing of early BattleNet days had no way of sorting out who would be a challenging opponent and who would be boring to play against, or, for mediocre players like me, the hope against the odds that you'll come across someone who plays even slower than you do. When StarCraft 2 finally rolled around, it would sort players into leagues based on general performance, a real revolution based off of visible divisions in the player base from back in the Brood War days. The next StarCraft would be friendlier to players like me. But that's the heart of why Brood War is still enduringly popular despite its age and its sequel's popularity. It is not for people like me at all. It is a challenging expansion for the players most passionate about StarCraft's original, default mechanical difficulty and intricacy. A lot of the missions in Brood War average 40 minutes or more. Their battles are so protracted and difficult. Since you still play each race in a linear order, you're up against long stretches of very difficult missions with a race you might not feel wholly at home with playing. The idea, of course, is to make you feel at home through attrition and by refusing to yield until the level teaches you its lesson. I'm a poor student of Brood War, strategically, mechanically, but I can still enjoy it for how much groundwork it lays for the plot of future Starcraft titles. Brood War contains a ton of particular details of plot and character that the series would return to, as much as the original campaign, if not more. Legacy of the Void especially brings a lot of Brood War's plot back around again. Artanis, who's a side character here, is the main character there. The idea of the Xel'Naga is expanded on here in Brood War, and one of the villains, Duran, reappears as early as Wings of Liberty as the evil Dr. Nerud. Seriously. Stukov, a significant character in Heart of the Swarm, is introduced back here in Brood War. A lot happens in Brood War, and the amount of dialogue and exposition is sometimes more ambitious than the game's ability to meaningfully portray it. Often, you'll just wait for a character to narrate their way through a big paragraph or two at the end of a mission before the next briefing. Having gone back to Brood War after playing the much fancier Hollywood-influenced sequels, I feel like the low-key presentation is a major part of the charm of the original games. They do what they can with the technology they have, and it's easy to feel generous towards the too long, too sincere declarative speeches that tend to characterize StarCraft dialogue. That bombast makes up for the underwhelming and static in-game cutscenes, like how silent movie stars dial up their facial expressions to compensate for not being heard. The original game and Brood War were pioneer titles for real-time strategy. It showed that games could not only come up with something strategically compelling enough for almost 2 decades of competitive play, but that they could throw in a whole galaxy of backstory and lore to prop up the action and have it evenly blend. StarCraft 1 was almost an accidental juggernaut. Its popularity and impact went way beyond its low-key presentation, mostly due to its fantastic balance and rhythm of play. StarCraft 2 had a difficult jumping-off point for a sequel then, a follow-up that has to try and expand on and improve on a title that's already about as tightly wound as a game can be. Wings of Liberty, the first of 3 episodes that compose the whole of StarCraft 2, wasn't released until 2010. Not only was it a whole 12 years on from the first game, it was 7 years after Warcraft 3's Frozen Throne expansion. In the meantime, Blizzard became known as the World of Warcraft developer first and foremost, so swinging back in with a new real-time strategy, after the better part of a decade away, carried with it a lot of expectations. Chris Metzen, lead writer for Wings of Liberty, characterized it this way in an interview with Polygon. Quote, StarCraft 2 was a much more robust narrative than anything we had tried before, and so when you ask what had changed, everything. Everything. We wanted to build the biggest, craziest space opera we could. That's what we tried to do. In a way, they succeeded. StarCraft 2 is pretty much the most operatically ridiculous, lavishly produced, mechanically solid trio of strategy games on the market. It's hard to know where to start, but key to understanding the differences between the first and second StarCraft, both its successes and excesses, is taking into account how World of Warcraft changed Blizzard as a company. Blizzard was no longer a pop-cultural outsider producing outsider art. It was one of the most successful game businesses around on account of their internationally addictive MMO hit. World of Warcraft brought into the gaming subculture thousands and thousands of people who might have otherwise let games pass them by, who experienced World of Warcraft as their first and most memorable game experience. StarCraft wasn't really on the radar for a lot of these players. Brood War enjoyed lasting success all the way up through 2010 and beyond on account of its value as a serious electronic sport. 12 years of the same game, though, especially one based on 2D sprites, makes people hungry for a facelift. So Blizzard needed to market to 2 audiences simultaneously. The players who loved the Blizzard of the 21st century and might not have even heard of StarCraft 1, who loved the addictive mechanics and self-consciously epic narratives of World of Warcraft, and then also the many fans who had been playing Brood War for a dozen years, mastering it, wanting better and bigger and more. So no wonder, then, that Wings of Liberty, more than any of its predecessors or successors, seems to suffer from an outrageous production bloat. It's not necessarily a step down in writing quality from the first game. They're pretty comparable in terms of camp and expository dumps. The difference is that StarCraft 2 presents its plot in a very over-the-top, Hollywood-influenced way, aping camera angles from shows like Battlestar Galactica, throwing down a sweeping, full orchestra soundtrack, and investing in the kind of high-detail, high-budget cinematic videos that have become a signature Blizzard touch since Warcraft 3. Wings of Liberty is a deep-fried ball of gourmet cheese in terms of story, but it's an improvement over the original in almost every other aspect of its single-player campaign. The moment I realized I was going to have a difficult time getting on board with Wings of Liberty's new style of story presentation came before even the first mission. Raynor's at a bar, drinking like he has been since apparently the end of the Brood Wars. He changes his mind about just sitting around and drinking. Let's watch, real quick. Catch the feeling.
Very soon. It ain't over till it's over, you son of a bitch. Adjutant, are my troops ready yet?
Your forces are prepared and awaiting your orders, Commander. Uploading tactical data now.
Good. About time we kick this revolution into overdrive.
Back in 2010, I couldn't believe how self-serious it was. Was I about to play a Starcraft game, or was Raynor about to ride a BMX bikes while drinking Mountain Dew Code Red? It was difficult to tell, and the first mission isn't wholly promising either. It's a quick and easy Control-A tutorial, and then the second is that repeat of Desperate Alliance. After those two, though, is an impressive action sequence done using the in-game engine detailing your escape on the battlecruiser Hyperion. Once aboard, you get to sample the full scope of the campaign, get introduced to the new between-mission diversions, like upgrades, mercenaries, and side conversations. The structure of the campaign is modular, customizable, and in classic Blizzard fashion, built to be as addictive as possible to play. Rewards come in quick, from player recognition in the form of achievements to upgrade and research points. One thing I find especially enjoyable about the single-player campaign of all three StarCraft II titles is that it willingly gives up the delicately weighted balance of the multiplayer, giving you special units, special structures, special abilities of increasing destructive utility that would never be fair to use against a live opponent. It lets you steamroll your way through situations more tactically difficult than you would get in the multiplayer, set up by the outlandish nonsense of the advancing plot. Later on in the Polygon interview, Metzen reflected on Wings of Liberty's campaign's dialogue like this. Looking back at the writing stuff over time, there's stuff that I'm super embarrassed by, whether it was just bad writing or there were ideas that were really important to me at the time. But I look back and I feel exposed, chasing themes or story moments that meant a lot at the time. But for every one of those, I'm equally proud of having taken the step, taken a stand, clumsy as it may have been. It was real. It was pure art at the time. Wings of Liberty really does have that feel to it. For all its cheese, and there is a lot of cheese, it's an incredibly earnest title. That's maybe the main characteristic of the kind of storytelling that runs through all the StarCraft titles. The big ideas seem kind of derivative at first, but the creators cared about the details on a very personal level, and put their unique creative spin on every tired cliché, every point of damage, every lore-heavy expositional dump, every smooth and eye-catching animation. The sincerity comes off as pretty goofy at worst, and genuinely endearing at best. All told, it's hard to hold a grudge against Metzen for Wings of Liberty's writing, when even he has trouble getting through some of it, and is big enough to admit it. It's harder still when you consider that the writing had a practical purpose running through it that the game achieves independently of any narrative purpose, giving the player a good setup for a challenge that feels fresh and exciting every single mission. StarCraft II, like Warcraft 3 before it, has several difficulty settings. Hard is similar to the original game's difficulty, and normal is geared towards people who, like me, got stumped or would be stumped by Brood War. There's also brutal difficulty for the serious enthusiast, and casual. Casual's a weird one. It's like a non-difficulty, where the enemy barely even bothers to resist. Normal's a lot more engaging. If you've had a few cracks at the original game, StarCraft II on normal difficulty can feel like it's taking a minute to warm up, but by the time you're choosing between planets, you're up against some interesting challenges, and I found the difficulty pretty much perfect for what I really wanted out of a real-time strategy campaign like StarCraft. The chance to experience the mechanics as a puzzle, and not a speed competition. To play the game strategically, but play the game slow. It's rewarding, and the fact that there are dozens and dozens of achievements for playing a mission with extra conditions or in certain time frames gives extra incentive to just fool around and have fun. Like the first StarCraft, each mission serves to introduce a particular unit or tactic by having the mission's success hinge on mastering the new element, but unlike StarCraft 1, that's never the only thing that a mission is trying to do. Single player is no longer a tutorial first and a space opera second, it's a more satisfying and evenly weighted fusion of the two. When the game introduces the Hellion, a light buggy with a flamethrower, it does it by pitting you against a week-long onslaught by a Zerg-infested colony. You send out the Hellions by day to burn down as much as you can, and then batten down the hatches to defend yourself at night from a horde of shambling, mutated zombies. Of course, you can continue to burn the colony at night, but as each day passes, the horde grows stronger. All this in about half an hour of playtime. So sure, Dr. Henson is a flat character, and the ideas behind her missions have been done before in a lot of media, but like Desperate Alliance, Outbreak transcends the cliches, and through a tactical reframing of something usually presented up close as horror or action, with a unique, cohesive approach to art direction that ties it all up neatly. The fact that Starcraft II relies so heavily on tried-and-true sci-fi tropes is more readily apparent than the original game, because it's also using tried-and-true presentation techniques. But the game itself, in the playing of it, the rhythms and the feel, is still uniquely Starcraft. Other levels, like the Devil's Playground, pit you against the environment in ways that the original never could. Lava tides render huge parts of the map uninhabitable every few minutes, and you have to plan around those. Or, how about Media Blitz, where you launch a surprise attack on Menk's throne world of Korhal with a commandeered mech and a ton of air support, with the purpose of using his broadcast equipment to spread Raynor's rebellion. The missions in Wings of Liberty are a lot bolder and a lot bigger in scope than the original campaign, although they're never tactically as challenging as Brood War. The problem with that is that if you play the campaign on normal difficulty, you'll have a satisfying campaign, but you won't be all the way prepared for multiplayer. The best idea in all of StarCraft II is its inclusion of leagues. After your first few matches, your performance and speed is rated internally by the game, and you're assigned to a league consisting of people who play the game at similar speeds and levels of difficulty as you do. Bronze League is at the bottom, and it's reliably fun. Amateurs against amateurs, trying out whatever works on folks too inexperienced to read any of the tells of production. From there it goes up through Silver, Gold, Platinum, Diamond, Master, and Grandmaster leagues. Each community is a distinct skill group, close enough in the spread to be grouped together, far enough apart to allow a variety of playstyles. Wings of Liberty's single-player only lets you play as the Terrans, outside of a 4-level set of Protoss missions, which take the form of flashbacks with Zeratul, Raynor's old Dark Templar friend. The multiplayer was a fully fleshed-out sequel for all 3 races, but the campaign only taught you seriously how to play one. If there's one major failing of the way StarCraft II was released in 30-mission expansions, it's that the original game was a totally self-contained package, giving the player everything they need to know the lore and the mechanics inside and out by the time they play against another person. Not that StarCraft veterans needed it, or that new players couldn't figure it out perfectly well on their own, but it's one of the reasons that the first game is so highly regarded that the episodic sequel didn't really recapture. But giving each race a whole 30-mission spread also gives the feeling of epic weight to the individual campaign, and in this way the episodic structure lets it truly be the crazy space opera they wanted. Wings of Liberty is great in a lot of ways, less often in the big details of plot and character, more often in the tiny details of player exploration, like the shit-kickin' Zerg-themed country tunes they made for the jukebox, or the joke dialogue for units, or the riot of color that erupts during combat. The way it isn't great are right up front and glaringly obvious, like anything involving Prince Valerian. What anime did that guy get fired from to wind up in a game like StarCraft II anyway? There's a lot of dumb stuff, because Wings of Liberty is so damn excited to be a high-budget, market-broadening title that it has no idea where the top was even supposed to be in the first place, let alone an idea of what point they went over it. Wings of Liberty's weaknesses were instructive for Blizzard, though. Heart of the Swarm, the Zerg expansion, improves upon the campaign of Wings of Liberty in every way. Before Heart of the Swarm, the last you saw of Kerrigan, self-described queen bitch of the universe, was being carried in the arms of dreamy old Jim Raynor, made human again through some Xel'Naga space magic. It was kind of a sour note to end on for a couple-of-year gap. All that nonsense in the dialogue, and they've got to disempower Kerrigan as well. I didn't see the obvious, though. You've got to disempower a godlike character if you want them to repeat their rise to power all over again when they star in their own sprawling expansion. Heart of the Swarm, from a single-player perspective, is my favorite out of all of the StarCraft releases. It's the most unpredictable, well-written, and unique. It takes all the feverish enthusiasm of Wings of Liberty and channels it in sharper directions. Like in StarCraft I, the Zerg campaign is the most genuinely original in terms of world-building and characters. The Zerg are the most alien, in form and attitudes, but what makes them so fantastic isn't just how weird they are. It's the incredible thematic and mechanical harmony they have. The way you have to grow out your creep to expand buildings on, the way you have to grow your entire army from larvae, the way you sacrifice your units to create buildings, the mechanical pressure you feel to display the cruelty and savagery that a race that doesn't value its individual organisms must be capable of. It all flows together in such a compelling way. The Terrans are fun, sure, but they're mostly distinctive for being space rednecks, and the Protoss are so stuffy, straightforward, and mired in fantasy tropes, like extreme chivalry and fanatical devotion to religious tradition, that neither have ever been quite as vibrant as the Zerg. The thrill of playing the Zerg is that you are playing a villain, but you're playing one that's destructive and cruel by nature and not necessarily intention. That's why Kerrigan makes such a good focus for the campaign, especially here in Heart of the Swarm. In Brood War, she was one-dimensionally evil, and that was the majority of her character arc. Throughout the whole expansion, it wasn't completely clear how much of her humanity remained intact, but by the time you get to the Zerg campaign of Brood War, it's clear that none of it has. She's been manipulating all of the main characters, drawing them in with small acts of kindness, before stabbing them all in the back and seizing control of the swarm. It was so unusual for video games, that kind of descent into monstrousness, especially since it was done with such winning camp. These days, there's a lot of popular media that we watch to see villains connive their way to success, like House of Cards, Game of Thrones, but Brood War was a little ahead of the curve. Heart of the Swarm reframes all of that in a very compelling way, hinging off of the doofy end of Wings of Liberty. Kerrigan being made human was less about Raynor being rewarded with getting his girlfriend back, and more about setting Kerrigan up to have a moral conflict over leading the Swarm, about dialing her back from explicit villain to flawed heroine. Heart of the Swarm is all about Kerrigan choosing to become the Queen of Blades again, but for her own reasons, on her own terms, without Mengsk or the Overmind casting their shadows. More than any other Starcraft release, Heart of the Swarm embraces the exotic in its level design, its narrative, and its tactical progression. You can predict nearly every story beat of Wings of Liberty pretty much right off the bat, even if the missions themselves are a delight. Heart of the Swarm is just as much fun to play, but it's much harder to predict. A major part of the campaign's appeal is that Kerrigan's development arc as a character dovetails so neatly with the player's gradual climb up the upgrade tree, the familiar unlocking of units and ratcheting up of strategic difficulty. The first mission is fantastic at setting the tone. Kerrigan is being kept at a science facility where Valerian is trying to see if she can control the Zerg for him, like the UED once controlled the Overmind in Brood War. Kerrigan instantly disobeys him, spawns a Zergling swarm, and wrecks half the facility. It's a great introduction to both the Zerg as a race and Kerrigan as a character, defiance and destruction in equal measure. As the campaign continues, Kerrigan finds that she has to give away more and more of her human values and body to seize full control of the swarm. It's more nuanced than Brood War. You see Kerrigan genuinely conflicted between human morality and the animal leadership needed to dominate the brood. The Zerg characters aboard the flagship, in between missions, don't seem half as campy as the Hyperion's inhabitants, at least partially because they seem so far from human that their exaggerated emotions and expressions come across as more reasonable, part of the slithery charm of the Zerg. Abathur, particularly, is one of the best secondary characters in the franchise. Created by the Overmind to expand the genetic possibilities of the Zerg, Abathur was the one who turned Kerrigan into the Queen of Blades in the first place, a one-of-a-kind holdover from the Overmind's original vision for the destiny of the Zerg. He and Kerrigan have a very interesting relationship that develops, with Abathur caring only about his mutations and experiments, constantly forgetting that Kerrigan outranks him, and Kerrigan leaning on his secret knowledge while trying to maintain meaningful authority. Abathur also mines the Zerg equivalent of the research upgrade tree, but a much, much more interesting one. Here, you play mutation missions, where Abathur shows 2 genetic variations of a unit, specializing it further to suit individual playstyles and preferences. Instead of just giving you a menu and having you pick, you zoom to 2 different planets, where local conditions conspired to draw out a new unit's particular characteristics. You cause a little mayhem with both variations. Only then do you choose, having gotten a chance to feel them out beforehand. It's a wonderful, hugely engaging way to go about it, and you might surprise yourself by going against your first impulse when you finally do choose between 2 variations. Heart of the Swarm is also much more noticeably tied to Warcraft 3's design than Wings of Liberty ever was, that game going way out of its way to make sure that it felt like Starcraft and only like Starcraft. Heart of the Swarm, though, is much more interested in hero units and use of hero abilities than any previous Starcraft title. A lot of how they do it is enjoyable, but you have to wonder where the intention comes from. Is Heart of the Swarm more interested in hero units than before because of the popularity of MOBAs, or because Blizzard wanted to keep exploring an avenue of design that they left dormant for the better part of a decade since Warcraft 3? Is it forward-looking, or is it backward-looking? It's hard to say, made more difficult by the fact that Warcraft 3's hero-dependent design led directly to the rise of MOBAs as a genre. Defense of the Ancients was a Warcraft 3 mod before it was ever its own thing. There are parts of Heart of the Swarm that feel almost like an extension of the kind of work that Blizzard was doing in the Frozen Thrones bonus campaign, The Founding of Durotar. Small army adventuring, with boss fights. Something notably different from the hero-led facility missions that have been a series staple since the first Starcraft. This was something with more of an arcade gauntlet feel. The founding of Durotar was meant to explore mechanics that would eventually become World of Warcraft, but Heart of the Swarm? What does it gain from being so hero-focused? Well, for one thing, it works well with how tightly focused on Kerrigan's character arc the game is. Not only does she lead armies thematically, she's up at the front lines with them in mission after mission. These mechanics reach their zenith in the mission Supreme, where Kerrigan undergoes a process to renew her connection to the Zerg, where she goes into a chrysalis again and emerges as the Queen of Blades like before, but as a member of the Primal Zerg, the original brood, untouched by the Overmind. She would be an individual in a way that she hadn't before. When the chrysalis opens, she's got some ass to kick, and the game wants you to have a front row seat for it, defeating the other Primal Zerg who want to consume Kerrigan and steal her adaptations. It's serious camp sci-fi, sure, with only the most tenuous connections to real biology, but it's got just enough truthiness to feel cohesive, to let the Zerg be as weird as they want to be, while still being able to follow the logic of their design. There are other missions that play around with the well-worn scales and rhythms of Starcraft as well. With Friends Like These is a great example. It's a mission where Kerrigan asks Horner for help, and you guide the Hyperion through a naval combat puzzle. This blend of space magic nonsense that's classic StarCraft writing, mixed with a much stronger and more focused character development and world-building, made Heart of the Swarm a quirky and distinctive game experience. But as the middle campaign, it didn't have much of a chance to make a big independent impact, not as much as Wings of Liberty or Legacy of the Void. There was still the one last expansion coming up, one last chance to make StarCraft bigger, faster, stronger. There's another lesson they could have learned from Warcraft 3, though. The more you throw in a strategy title, the harder it is to maintain meaningful balance, to retain the focus that drove the original mechanical design. Legacy of the Void is meant to draw the entire years-spanning story of StarCraft to a close, to shape the multiplayer into its most modern iteration, and to provide a platform for future StarCraft content. It's a big mandate. To get everyone excited for it, folks who pre-ordered were given early access to Whispers of Oblivion, a 3-mission prologue centered around Zeratul. The missions are pretty tough, and the production values are very high. Plus, it was great to put in some serious footwork in ferreting out where the plot was headed next, setting up what Legacy of the Void would accomplish. Way back in Wings of Liberty, Zeratul had a vision, in the form of an amazing base defense mission, of the end of all things. Aemon, the big celestial evil behind Duran and his Protoss-Zerg hybrids, would destroy all other life, including the Protoss, during a noble but doomed final stand. Kerrigan was the key to stopping it, the prophecy says. The Overmind's prophecy, mind. He created Kerrigan to fulfill this specific destiny. And her renewal as the primal Queen of the Blades had let her break free from Aemon's ability to control her and thwart that long-ago vision of doom. Now, with that particular vision of the future behind them, Zeratul looks to see if Aemon has any weaknesses at all. Predictably, it's the keystone that's been featured at the climaxes of both previous expansions. Now, that all sounds really convoluted when you condense it like that, but consider this. There are more or less 150 missions in all of StarCraft, 150 twists and turns in the plot. Space opera was a term originally coined to refer to sprawling, multi-volume sci-fi novels with tons of characters and a ton of plot, the kind of stuff Peter F. Hamilton does. But it's kind of a derisive term, too, since it's meant to compare them to soap operas, which also have a lot of convoluted and unnecessary story arcs on account of being on television week after week after week for decades in a row. StarCraft is deserving of the term space opera on both counts. It is a serious space epic, constantly one-upping itself in plot twists and action sequences, both player-controlled and cinematic ones, and in character drama. The Protoss, culturally, are the most persnickety race of them all, and the entire plot arc of the Templar cast can pretty much be summed up as the slow removal of the stick up their butts so that everyone can band together and kill the potential demon god. While the writing in Legacy of the Void has some legitimately well-done and even subtle moments, it can't escape from the fact that the Protoss bring out the soap opera elements of the space opera plot more than any of the others. Wings of Liberty was cheesy, but ultimately so geared towards action that its momentum glossed over a lot of the damage. Maybe it's because they have no mouths that the Protoss are so ridiculously self-serious. You've got to really emote the fuck out of your lines when your facial expression is more or less fixed. In any case, Zeratul, like Tassadar, is infallibly noble and fixated on the Xel'Naga mystery. He makes an efficient detective that way. In his 8 levels across 3 expansions, he pretty much unravels the entire plot. It's dressed up to Kerrigan, Raynor, and the now much older Artanis to push it a little further. Whispers of Oblivion is, on top of being a solid promotion and a worthwhile transition between expansions, a fond farewell to one of the franchise's most iconic figures. Legacy of the Void has far too many compacted plot twists for everyone to survive. Like the rest of the expansions, it has obvious strengths and weaknesses, but Legacy of the Void is a tremendous value for the investment. The multiplayer is expanded and revised, the single player barrels directly towards a concrete climax for plot threads left dangling since 1998. The whole game ramps up to recapture its audience one more time, giving its all to stay contemporary and relevant in a games market that's lost its taste for complicated real-time strategy titles. It doesn't do things in as scattershot a way as Wings of Liberty, but neither is it as narratively focused as Heart of the Swarm. Pretty much every briefing and side conversation caps off some kind of lingering question about lore and character. Since this is the last go-around, and the game is very conscious of that, it tries to cram in as much as possible into the 30 missions it does have. This has two ramifications in the pacing and the dialogue. The first is that it feels like an overstuffed suitcase of a story. You may want one story element, but you're going to need to unpack 3 more to get to it, and maybe reopen and reclose the lid afterwards when you notice a sleeve still sticking out. The second ramification is that you don't quite have the sense of exploratory curiosity that Heart of the Swarm had. You're spending much more of your time dotting the I's and crossing the T's of previous plot zigzags. That's not to say Legacy of the Void doesn't have its own story elements to introduce. It's got quite a few, but it can't linger on them. In fact, Legacy of the Void is so beholden to the twists and turns of the space operas before it that it has 2 climaxes. The first to resolve internally the issues of Legacy of the Void, and the second, a 3-mission epilogue that addresses the overarching plot of the entire franchise. It's a little peculiar to do it that way. I'm not sure why it wasn't more unified, if they had originally hoped to have more room for the epilogue content, or what. Either way, the structure is messy, but the intent and the execution is just as enthusiastic and fast-flowing as its predecessors, and it's extremely satisfying to get concrete lore about so many serious mysteries, even if it is a waterfall of information. Legacy of the Void, as a whole, is geared towards the interests of players who had been there since the beginning, either the beginning of Starcraft as a fledgling series, or the new beginning of Starcraft 2, which reached a far wider audience than the first. The game's plot stretches back into Brood War, plucking out characters and reintroducing themes. Its dialogue meaningfully fleshes out the more obscure points of Protoss culture and organization, and most importantly, Legacy of the Void's mechanical design unites the tactical intensity of Brood War with the single-player customization that had become a Starcraft 2 hallmark. It's not as hard as Brood War, not on normal anyway, but it's still much more interested in difficult tactical situations than Wings of Liberty or Heart of the Swarm. The Terran part of StarCraft 2 still sees itself as a tutorial and doesn't present really challenging maps until the later parts of the campaign. The Zerg part is too playful with the design, too invested in hero units to be as mindful of the 200 supply army strategic puzzles that characterized Brood War. Legacy of the Void, on the other hand, assumes that you're pretty handy with StarCraft already, and then tones down the importance of hero units from Heart of the Swarm. You still get a couple fantastic missions where hero units are the key to victory, but the overall feel is more classically StarCraft, more considered, less experimental. Appropriate for a Protoss campaign. Also appropriate for a Protoss campaign is how the Protoss's obsessive focus on broad-stroke politics is used to organize the missions and upgrade tree both. It's a Unite the Tribe scenario where different tribes, the High Templar of Ire, the Dark Templar of Shakuras, who are actually perfectly nice, along with newcomers the Tal'Darim, a lost tribe of Protoss who are all about power, brutality, and authority, and then finally the Purifiers, a Protoss-created machine race with unpredictable destructive quirks. As each tribe is united behind Artanis' leadership, their particular variant of unit types is unlocked. There are 3 variations of every unit pulled from all 4 tribes. It's a hell of a lot of customization and well-suited to the plot and feel of the game. Each unit manifests some value of its root faction and its design, brutal and industrial for the Tal'Darim, a kind of 70s futurism for the Purifiers, and the space fantasy vibe of the Dark Templar, all on top of the iconic StarCraft 1 look of the High Templar of Ire. There's even classic StarCraft 1 units in the game, my favorite being the Caterpillar-like Reaver. Many of these throwback units and variants are specific to the single-player campaign, intended to let players express their own personal tactical strengths and not be held back by considerations of balance versus other players. At the start of the Brood War, Artanis is a young and inexperienced Templar, beholden to tradition at the exact moment tradition is dooming their planet. The evacuation of Ire through to Shakuras kicks off the Brood War expansion, with Artanis and Phoenix leading the way. As Legacy of the Void opens, Artanis is ready to reclaim Ire for the High Templar. It doesn't go as planned. He needs to abandon tradition and embrace a bold new destiny for his people, to let go of what he thought it meant to be Protoss, to expand the definition and be made stronger for it. It's the same journey that Starcraft 2 attempted to make as a whole design package. Choosing to open on Artanis' heroic invasion of Zerg-occupied Aiur is a wonderful way to go about it. It immediately resonates with the rest of the franchise. Not since StarCraft 1 was Aiur truly the home of the Protoss, and you fought across its surface time and time again, like Char, a focusing point for the push and pull of extended war. The invasion is your first mission, the classic Control-A tutorial, but using the entire Golden Armada of the Protoss. It's fun, impressive, thematically resonant, and all too easy. Because it's a trap, of course. The way the Protoss work as a race isn't very satisfactorily explained in the first couple games, but it's gone into at length here. The Protoss of Aiur all hook into a kind of spiritual server hub called the Khala. Through the Khala, Aemon can possess and control the Protoss. The Dark Templar are regarded as exiles and heretics because they choose to live outside the Khala, separate individuals, alone from the comfort and closeness that other Protoss share through the Khala. When Artanis invades Aiur, only those Protoss who willingly sever their connection to the Khala, sever their hair tentacle braid things, can escape. Zeratul must fight Artanis' possessed body to free him from Aemon's grasp, and Zeratul dies in the process. Only Artanis now, and the handful of survivors, can carry on the Protoss, and they can never again carry on as part of the Khala the way they were before. It's a dire, interesting setup for the expansion, and it picks up more and more steam as it goes along. Artanis struggles to assume the mantle of galactic savior, but it couldn't be anyone other than a Protoss who could bear such a preposterous burden with any kind of dignity. Artanis and the Protoss seem completely immune to sarcasm and irony. They take every twist of the plot with appropriate seriousness and bluster. It works. Maybe it oughtn't to, but without a hint of resistance to the operatic craziness of the plot just glides right on through, carrying its momentum where a less confident production might have stumbled. The arc of the plot, the gather your army to defeat the big bad space god plot, has been done before. Many times. Never with quite the fervent, colorful enthusiasm of the StarCraft aesthetic and art style, though. It's like a really good cover of a very old song. You know the melody, but the new spin an artist puts on it gives it new life. What's unique about Legacy of the Void's story is that halfway through the game, Artanis and Kerrigan fulfill the Overmind's ancient prophecy and unite to finally call the attention of the Xel'Naga, the mysterious creators behind all life and half the moldering temples in the galaxy. The Xel'Naga's plan is revealed. They exist in the Void, between worlds, creating new universes. In each, two races eventually reach purity of essence and purity of form, the Protoss and the Zerg in this case, and together they merge and allow a new Xel'Naga to be born. Like the old saying, I guess, it takes a universe to raise a Xel'Naga. Aemon is one of them, but grew tired of the infinite cycle, so he killed all the others. Instead of being elevated to godhood in the middle of the campaign, Kerrigan and Artanis find a room full of dead squids from another dimension and a heap of disappointment. Aemon had to be stopped, and Aiur had to be saved, so that's exactly what Artanis does. Aemon is cast back into the Void, and the Protoss are free from his mental domination by the end of Legacy of the Void. You've won! Of course, Aemon is still perfectly fine back in the Void. You'll have to play the epilogue if you want to resolve that part of it. Into the Void delivers just that, one final chance to play each race in a shadowy realm beyond space itself. It's actually really good, and I wish it was more than just 3 levels. I would have liked to learn more about it. But explaining the Void is more than StarCraft 2 wants to do, ultimately. It just makes an ominous and interesting backdrop to the franchise finale. Artanis, Raynor, and Kerrigan, finally united in friendship and opposition to Aemon, venture through to the Void together. There, they defeat Duran once and for all, who had only been banished when Kerrigan defeated it the first time back in Heart of the Swarm. They also discover a Xel'Naga that Aemon had overlooked. It gives its power of godhood to Kerrigan, willingly letting the infinite cycle end, and giving true freedom of direction to all the universes tended to by the impossibly massive and ancient Xel'Naga Empire. It's Aemon's goal the whole time, kind of. He wanted the infinite cycle to end also. He was just an insufferable dick about it, with no interest in letting life seek a destiny outside his vision for it. Kerrigan, part human and part Zerg, is already pure enough of form and essence to house the bizarre raw power of the squid gods. Kerrigan becomes, for all intents and purposes, some kind of angel of light. Over the top doesn't cut it. This is completely ridiculous. But you could have, maybe should have, seen it coming. For better or worse, the story of StarCraft is Kerrigan's story. She has by far the most screen time of all the characters, the most influence in the twists and turns of the plot, and is one of gaming's most iconic franchise characters full stop. The actual root of the phrase deus ex machina is from ancient Greek theater. It means god from the machine, from a common theater trope where a god, suspended from a simple crane or harness above the stage, would float down and solve insoluble problems for the mortals so that everyone could wrap things up and take a bow. Seriously. So the phrase persisted because people still use deus ex machina to back themselves out of corners they've written themselves into, though rarely with quite so much literal fidelity to the phrase as Legacy of the Void has. Of course, Kerrigan's importance, the Overmind's prophecy and its vision of her as the key to the destiny of the Zerg and all other life, stretches all the way back to 1998 in the first Starcraft. It's always been headed this direction. It just feels extra janky because of how awkwardly placed in the narrative it is, using an epilogue to provide a franchise climax. But in any case, with the power of the Xel'Naga godhood coupled with the player's dexterous strategery, Eamon is finally well and truly destroyed. Kerrigan has broken the infinite cycle. What happens next is up to everyone else now. It's a good ending. But then the epilogue has another epilogue that's just a hilarious little feather in the game's soap opera cap. 2 years after Eamon's defeat, and Raynor is back at his bar from the opening of Wings of Liberty, feeling mopey and manly like usual. Let's catch the feeling together, one more time.
Just like you always said. You know, Matt, someday you're gonna wind up leading this bunch of misfits.
I made a deal with the devil, Jimmy. You will hold her life in your hands.
You about ready to get out of here, cowboy?
Hell, it's about time.
So, does Kerrigan ascending to become a god being of pure energy mean she can't, be Raynor's girlfriend and stuff? The player asks. I guess not, Blizzard helpfully responds, and then tosses this in as kind of a, hey, one last thing you should know kind of deal. Then there's ending slides. Ending slides in Starcraft. It's a little weird, but I guess they wanted to make sure that everyone knew that this was the absolute for sure ending with no epilogue to the epilogue's epilogue. So, how do I feel about seeing the end to a story that I started experiencing at the very tail end of my distant childhood? Pretty damn good, man. I've had some complaints about the campaigns of StarCraft. It's hard to find someone who doesn't have at least one or two. But the sum of all these releases, what they've meant to the RTS genre over almost 2 decades, is monumental. Legacy of the Void isn't even the absolute final end to StarCraft. There will be updates, refinements, tournaments, and recommendations from player to player that keep StarCraft in the public consciousness, keep it part of the way people perceive gaming. StarCraft doesn't occupy this extremely visible space in gaming just because the top players are so interesting to watch. It enjoys its success because it's learned, through hard lessons and countless man-hours, how to balance fulfilling the desires of top players and the desires of casual players in the same piece of software. People still love playing Brood War, but Brood War is a very specific, refined thing, perfected like a rock in a tumbler over years. Legacy of the Void is still growing and changing and relatively new. There will even be a bonus campaign of Special Ops featuring Nova the Ghost, another logical extension of the hero-centric levels they had been experimenting with throughout the campaigns. New multiplayer modes have also made their appearance, including a mode where 2 players control one base, one player handling the economy, and the second player handling the army. Legacy of the Void isn't refined like Brood War, but it is so many more sorts of game experiences to so many more sorts of players than Brood War that it doesn't have to be. It's a more malleable, accessible game than Brood War. I sometimes feel like it's just perception that keeps real-time strategy games from making a comeback. It's like chess. If you ask someone to play chess with you, chances are they'll say no, because the assumption goes that if you care enough about chess to ask about it, you must be good, and therefore probably not that fun to play if you don't play chess too often. No one expects someone to say, I'm terrible, let's do this. But when you're enthusiastic about a complicated strategy game like chess or like StarCraft, that's exactly how the feeling goes. The kind of instant matchmaking and league placement that StarCraft does as a standard feature eliminates that social barrier. If you want to play, You can, and then you'll be instantly seated with someone who's a ballpark match for you in skill. Starcraft as a franchise is so many things. It's a board game, it's a sci-fi epic, it's a soap opera, it's a competitive esport, it's a creative universe with an instantly recognizable vibe. Depending on the release, some of those elements might get fumbled. But StarCraft has always aspired to be all of those things simultaneously, and at its best moments, the moments we remember most as players, it does. It is. It's just frustrating to know there's whole other aspects and experiences of the game that I'll never appreciate firsthand. This is as far as my understanding of the game will get me, and this is the end of the bulk of this retrospective. But to answer some lingering questions I had about the StarCraft multiplayer experience, I also talked to another longtime series fan, David Passarella. David's not a serious StarCraft player either, but he does follow the competitive scene a lot more closely than I ever have, and I thought his answers were illuminating.
Good solid reaction from the older fan base because it's more like Brood War. It's a little more slow paced. It's a little more micro intensive. And what I mean by that is we have good units now. These new units in Legacy of the Void for all three races. I'll say, for example, like the Cyclone for the Terrans. It's like a unit that you can lock onto things and it fires missiles endlessly as long as it stays within range. That's just a little bit of extra thing instead of creating what is referred to as a death ball, like just control one. That's your entire army and attack move. That's sadly a lot of that happened in Heart of the Swarm and Wings of Liberty. But now we're having more micro intensive units, and people love to see that. Like the Zerg have Ravagers now. It's cool to see that instead of just Roach Hydralisk, we're seeing Roach and that unit. Oh gosh, the name just escaped my mind. Roach Ravager. By shooting the death corrosive bile or whatever, the thing that would force the enemy opponent to move his army out of the way. It's because going back to the dexterity thing, it's becoming more difficult, and I think that's really fun because it's challenging players even more. I'll say this without a doubt. I think StarCraft 2 is StarCrafter is the most difficult competitive competitive game, actually, because of the amount that's required of you. Not only are you managing economy, not only are you building bases, you're also controlling an army possibly on multiple fronts. You're Terran, you're using medevacs, and you're dropping in multiple locations, and then you're microing those units away from something, like a pylon with overcharge on it. It's just so great to see now that it's not just a big build a death ball thing. Don't get me wrong, death balls are always going to exist, but now with more micro, we're going to see a lot more splitting. We're going to see a lot more just management. Fun for me. But sorry, I'm going off on tangents. I love the game. I'm looking forward to seeing people play Legacy of the Void competitively, because right now even the pros are still mastering they're still making strategies because the game's so new. We don't have anything hard coded yet. We're seeing what works, we're seeing what doesn't work. It's funny if you look right now, you're seeing some competitive players. Sorry, I can't name their names, I don't know all of them, but I'm seeing some of them stuck in the old ways, right? They're still playing like it's Heart of the Swarm, and they're kind of getting toasted by people who are like, it's time to move on. This isn't Heart of the Swarm anymore. You got to be using more units. Like some Protoss, at first they're starting to do it much more. At first didn't really like the Adept, and now they've grown to love it. It's become an invaluable unit that people would use to scout with because it has the shade ability where you send the shade off and you can like go up a ramp that's blocked by say you're playing at a Terran opponent. He's got his barracks and he's got his 2 supply depots blocking you. Hey, normally if you go up there, you'd get a unit shot up, but you can send the shade up, say, oh, he's stuck in there. I can go scout around other places. They are the greatest balancers of units. Not only did they keep. It's an amazing thing when you can take a base game like StarCraft, which is really great, right, and make it better. Like, they kept everything that was in StarCraft 1, and they just added a few units here, a few units there, and yet they still managed to keep the balance. Of course, some things were a bit cheesy. Like there's a great video on YouTube that shows 7 years of StarCraft, and it shows from version 1.0 to version, I don't remember the number, but where they basically just show these balance changes that Blizzard had to work on over and over and over and over and over again. It's disgusting how much work they put into it, but it's heart and soul that really required that. When I got super serious with StarCraft 2, and I went up from bronze to silver to gold league, I got really, really, really stressed out. And it was just, I'm like, this is a game I'm supposed to be having fun, and even at that low level, I'm like just a low level little dude. I'm like, oh, this is stressing me out too much. Um, but in terms of popularity, I think StarCraft will continue to be a niche. I don't see it dying, but I can definitely see the impact of what MOBAs have done to like definitely to StarCraft 2 competitive multiplayer. And it kind of makes me sad because I love watching it. I mean I can't do it at all. Like I can't do this with like constantly for like 20 minutes. I'll get a cramp or something like that and lose a limb. Um, I just hope it doesn't go away. I don't see it happening, but I see it continuing to fade, especially now that the final installment of StarCraft 2 has come out. Um, but here's my thing: why I'm partially glad that I never became professional at it is that I feel like there comes a point when those players stop loving the game. You know, I love StarCraft. I love the story. I love playing it, but but I also know, okay, I don't want I don't want to go get nuts with this game because if I genuinely wonder if the greatest player in the world or the greatest players in the world have fun playing StarCraft anymore. I really do. Well, you're as a spectator, you're not really going to see the dexterity of a player, um, until unless for example, in the most recent tournaments, they have something called the first person mode or something like that, where they take you away from what you're seeing on the screen and they show you the players going crazy on their keyboards, jumping all over the map, training units, building buildings, microing units all at the same time. Watching a strategy unfold is super entertaining as a viewer because you see them you see these players hit these timings like oh crap, look at that, he's at this point where this guy can't respond, he can lay on the pressure, he can end the game right now.
Thanks for watching. All of my videos are supported by crowdfunding through the website Patreon. I want to thank by name some of the people who are currently pledging $10 a month or more to support the kind of content that I'm doing. People like Stephen Potyak, Angel-Headed Hipster, Todd M. Martin, Paul Cocker, Weaver, Matthew Zender, Dylan Sibley, Cameron Jackson, David Fry, David Reed, Josh, Boris Nielsen, Michael Atwell, Cameron, Alexander Leister, David Gilbreth, I Cannot Fly, Wesley M., Aaron Albach, Alexander Heavens, Noah Duggins, Martin Karsten, Galak, Brad Gялmo, Morton Sconning, Andreas Larson, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Colin, Brad Carr, Ivan Marinov, Josh Farkas, Krish Larkey, Aiden AK-47, Dewey, Anax of Rhodes, Niels Bachfrummer, Spyro Sedaris, Rob Clark, Harley McAvoy, Yuri Petnis, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Joshua Vivi, Tizer the Carrion, Irvin, Joe Hervison, Brad Smith, Connor Biblo, Brad Wallace, Ryan Gunst, Preston Allen, Sigmund Copperwood, Stephen Lark, Amir Aguilar, Jeffrey Knutson, D, Kimo Heikkinen, Joe Wolf, Sangustin, Oliver Hendliken, White Zero, Cassie, Comfy Hat, Ron Gervais, Christian Zacharianson, Pat Hay, Zoe Sheik, Balder Carlson, Dennis Clark, Nick Cole Hamilton, Kevin DeBolt, Jake Brennan, Ken Young, Dalton Seiler, Brian Hill, Igor Babiuk, Niles D. McDonald, Justin Hughes, Kumaran Vajayan, Nobody, Andrew Steele, Jared Meyer, John Walsh, Lee Jones, Daniel Mower Myrie, Alex Zelato, Brandon Boat, Stephen Premel, Matthew, Nathan Campbell, Devin Fitzpatrick, Jake Mays, and Sasha Ayage. Thanks again so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate all the help I get per month to actually make these videos and live out what I like to do. Thanks for watching.